Okay, hello everybody.
Hi,
Here we
Rabbi.
go. Hello, Rose. All right. So,
How are you, Rabbi?
well, we'll find out. We left off in the middle of this unit on some of the early teachings of Hasidism. And here we are at text number 8. This is this story of the Baal Shem Tov. Would someone else like to read this? If you have it in front of you or if you can see it on the screen.
I'll read it.
Go ahead, Lou.
Once the Baal Shem Tov and his disciples were on a journey. In a forest along the way, they chanced upon an abandoned synagogue and decided to pray the mincha service there. The disciples opened the door and invited their master to be the first to enter. Just as he was about to step inside, the holy Baal Shem Tov stopped and would not cross the threshold. The Chassidim were perplexed but reluctant to question their master. But after a while, when the sun began to set and it would soon be too late for mincha, they summoned up the courage to ask why he would not enter. The Baal Shem Tov replied, "I can't go in because it is so crowded. There is no room for us." The Chassidim were astounded because the synagogue was empty. Taking note of their confusion, he explained, "A prayer, when uttered sincerely and wholeheartedly, always sprouts wings and soars upwards to the throne of glory of the Creator himself. But I sense that the people who once prayed here had no kavanah. Their prayers
Had no wings.
no wings and collapsed and fell upon another, so that the building is now densely packed with dead, wingless prayers, and there is no room for us."
Mm-hmm. And you can pretty well imagine that this synagogue was not a Hasidic synagogue. It was probably a synagogue where the rules of prayer were very carefully observed, right? But maybe that's why it was abandoned, right? Because there was no kavanah, there was no feeling or intention, right? So, because it wasn't used properly, that's why it's now no longer used at all, right? So how do you get kavanah, right? How do you achieve proper concentration in prayer? So, the Baal Shem Tov said, well, you can't do it through self-denial, through setting aside the physical. And you can't eliminate all the distracting thoughts that you might have. You have to take those thoughts and elevate them. And so one of his associates, Rabbi Nachman of Horodenka, who was born before the Baal Shem Tov and outlived the Baal Shem Tov, he said that despite doing all sorts of personal mortifications, he said, I couldn't free myself from straying thoughts until I was converted to the wisdom of the Baal Shem Tov. Right? All right. Text number 9. Teaching in the name of the Baal Shem Tov. Someone else like to read this, please? I'm just having a hard time reading today.
I'll take it.
Go ahead, Luke.
I heard a teaching in the name of my teacher, the Baal Shem Tov, on the Talmudic directive. Rabbi Zera said, whoever says Shema, Shema is silenced. Rav Papa said to Abaye, perhaps he repeated himself because he did not have Kavanah at first. Abaye answered, who treats one's relationship with heaven as a casual friendship? If he didn't have proper Kavanah at first, he deserves to be jabbed with a blacksmith's poker until he does. And my teacher challenged this, saying, but the question still remains. Perhaps the person actually did not have the proper Kavanah at first, and now wants to fulfill his responsibility and pray with proper Kavanah. Furthermore, why did Rabbi Zera choose the Shema in explaining this law rather than some other verse? The Baal Shem Tov answered by examining the meaning of the acceptance of the responsibility of the kingship of heaven, Kabbalat al Malchut Shamayim. One is obligated to believe that the whole earth is filled with his blessed glory, and no place is devoid of his presence, even with all one's thoughts. His blessed reality is within them, and every thought has in it the entire divine being. So if an unseemly or strange thought comes to a person during prayer, he should understand that it came so that he can rectify and elevate it. If he does not believe this to be so, it indicates that his acceptance of the responsibility of the kingship of heaven is not complete, for he denies God's presence within the thought. This is how we can understand the teaching of the Talmud about Shema, Shema.
Okay, so the piece from the Talmud has a very straightforward explanation. You don't say Shema, Shema because that suggests there's more than one God. Right? And Abaye says, you shouldn't have the chutzpah to say Shema without preparing your thoughts properly. So, but the Baal Shem Tov says, well, you didn't really answer this. And maybe the problem is that if you were repeating Shema in this way, it would be because you don't recognize the bigger problem, which is to take that stray thought, which interfered with Kavanah, and raise it to a higher level. We already have had the teaching in Hasidism. It says there is no place that is devoid of God. And that's true even with those stray thoughts. Right? Even our sinful thoughts can be redirected. They can be elevated. And, in a similar way, Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev taught that, a lower form of love can be elevated by joining it to God, right? We saw much earlier in this class that even the Yetzer Hara can serve God. And the next text gives us another example of this. Right? Number 10. Would someone else be willing to read this?
Let me do it this time.
Go ahead, Roberto.
Okay. From the Baal Shem Tov, once there was a kind who ruled strictly and sent one of his servants to test his subject provinces by pretending he was a servant in rebellion against his master. Several of the subject provinces took up combat against him, the servant, and prevailed over him, while others went along with him. But in one state, there were wise men who sensed that this was all the request of the king. The moral is clear. There are some who combat the evil impulse, resisting him until he conquered the impulse through severe combat and mortification. And there are others who feel that he is carrying out the will of the Creator.
Right. So if the Yetzer Hara is God's will, then, you just have to work with it. You can't throw it out. You can't, it's like, so high you can't get over it, so low you can't get under it, right? You just have to live with it and, work with it. You don't reject the physical world, physical urgings. They are a way to appreciate the higher realms, right? And this leads us to another important idea in Hasidic thought, which is how spiritual life and thought elevate things that are mundane into things that are holy. And we're going to look at some examples here. Right? Number 11, right, from Tzavat HaRivash, this early Hasidic text. Someone else willing to read for us?
Let me try to do it one more time.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, I'm not very good in reading, that's why.
You're doing fine.
Consider that just as you contemplate material things, you contemplate the Shekinah, presence beside you. This is called Avodah Bekadnut, service through lesser consciousness. In this state, you might occasionally comprehend that there are many spherical heavens encircling you, while you stand on a point of this small planet Earth, and whole world is as nothing compared to the Creator, who is the Ein Sof, who performed the Tzimtzum and made space for him within himself to create the worlds. Even if you understand this intellectually, you are unable to ascend to the upper worlds. This is the meaning of the "from afar the Lord appeared unto me," that we see God only from a distance. But through worship, God will gadlut, greater consciousness. You strengthen yourself with great force and ascend in your thought, penetrating all the heavens at once, rising beyond the angels and the Ophanim and the Sepharim and the thrones. This is perfect worship.
Mm-hmm. So Katnut, this lesser consciousness, is just, it's kind of an intellectual contemplation. It's you feel like you're just, a fragment in the cosmos, right? But if you give your spirit over completely, you get to a more powerful form of Devoid, which gets through all obstacles. And, it enables you to reach this higher level through this greater consciousness, right? That, if all human thoughts contain God's being, then there has to be a place in those thoughts where you're able to connect with God. And that sounds a little bit paradoxical, right? Well, paradox is an important part of Hasidic teaching. And very often, you'll see that as a way of kind of getting through certain barriers, whether they are barriers of kavanah or barriers in relationships. And that brings us to this story which we see in text number 12. Someone read this for us, please.
In the name of Hasidic leader Rabbi Israel of Ruzhin, the story is told of a certain young man who was living at his father-in-law's house in a town dominated by opponents of Hasidism. He had promised his father-in-law on a handshake, which had the validity of an oath, that he would not travel to visit the Maggid of Mezerich, but his desire to go could not be restrained. He broke his promise and traveled to Mezerich on more than one occasion. His father-in-law consulted the town's rabbi and was told that, according to the halacha, his daughter must be divorced from her husband. Once the couple were divorced, the young man was thrown out of his father-in-law's house and remained penniless. He lived in the Beit Midrash until he fell ill and died. The Rabbi of Ruzhin concluded the story with the following insight. When the Messiah comes, this young man will take his case to a court of law presided over by the Messiah himself. He will summon his father-in-law and charge him with having caused his death, but the father-in-law will defend himself on the grounds that he had simply followed the ruling of the town's rabbi. The town's rabbi will be summoned next, and he will point to the halachic basis for his ruling. The Messiah will then wish to know why the young man had broken his promise to his father-in-law, and the young man will plead, "I was very eager to visit the Rebbe." The Messiah will pronounce as follows. To the father-in-law, he will say, "You followed the ruling of the town's rabbi, and you have acted justly." To the rabbi, he will say, "You ruled according to the halacha, and you have acted justly." But I, the Messiah, will say, "I have come to those who have acted unjustly."
Yeah. So here, we have a case of a Chassid versus his misnagid father-in-law, one of the opponents of Chassidism. And, the rules are supposed to be set out in the halakha, but when the halakha leads to injustice, the Messiah or his stand-in, who is the tzaddik himself, they have to protest, and they even hold God responsible. Some of you may have heard, the stories of Levi Yitzchak of Berdichev, who was known as one who stood up to God in those kinds of situations. Everybody else has to do their part. The people have to repent. The leader has to purify himself. But God also has to have Rahmanas for us. God also has to do God's part. Right? Parables are very, very important in Hasidic teaching. And the most famous Hasidic teacher in this respect is Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav. Right? Rabbi Nachman also told many very lengthy stories, which are also deserving of a lot of study and discussion, but we really don't have time for that. As it happens, Rabbi Nachman of Bratslav was the great grandson of the Baal Shem Tov. But he went on his own special way, and he emphasizes very strong reliance on faith and, very simple kind of faith, not like some of the more complex mysticism of other early Hasidic masters. He also didn't get along very well with some of the Hasidic masters of his time. Maybe they saw him as kind of encroaching on their territory. So he traveled around, and quite a few people followed him around, but he eventually settled in Wrocław in 1802. And then he eventually went to the city of Uman in the Ukraine the year before he died. And he was never that successful in his lifetime, but Wrocławer Hasidim are one of the more successful branches of Hasidism today, and they've never replaced him. They are sometimes referred to as the dead Hasidim, because they're the ones with a dead Rebbe, right? This was long before the seventh Lubavitcher Rebbe, right? The Chabad Rebbe. And many Wrocławer Hasidim make pilgrimage to Rabbi Nachman's grave, especially on Rosh Hashanah. Could be that, people just loved his stories so much that they don't need another Rebbe because they have all these wonderful stories. So we'll just share a few of those little story-like teachings. Number 13. Someone mind reading this piece, please?
The evil impulse, Yetzer Hara, is like a prankster running through a crowd, showing his tightly closed hand. No one knows what he is holding. He goes up to each and asks, "What do you suppose I have in my hand?" Each one imagines the closed hand contains just what he desires most. They all hurry and run after the prankster. Then when he has tricked them all into following him, he opens his hand. It is completely empty. The same is true of the evil impulse. He fools the world, tricking it into following him. All men think his hand contains what they desire, but in the end he opens his hand. There is nothing in it, and no desire is ever fulfilled. So it is with all worldly pleasures, which is like sunbeams in a dark room. They may actually seem solid, but one who tries to grasp a sunbeam finds nothing in his hand. The same is true of all worldly desires.
Mm-hmm. So for Rabbi Nachman, the evil impulse is this, struggle that we have, which we can never really fulfill, because there are always desires that we can't fulfill, right? And if we follow the Yetzer Hara in looking for those desires, we may wind up with nothing, right? You wind up with the empty hand, right? So Rabbi Nachman says, you have to kind of turn away from those things in this world, right? So he is extremely ascetic, much more so than most Hasidic Rebbes, and he's especially concerned about sex, right? We're going to come back to that a little bit later, right? Most Hasidic teachers focused on avodah b'gashmiut, service through the physical, elevating physical desires, which were sometimes referred to as stray thoughts, right? Text number 14 is another wonderful parable with multiple interpretations possible, right? So someone can read this for us, please.
Once there was a prince who had lost his mind and thought he was a turkey. He would sit naked under a table and eat the crumbs and bones off the floor. All of the doctors lost hope in curing him from this malady, and the king was very sad. Finally, a person came and said that he could cure him. This wise man removed his clothing and joined the king's son under the table. Who are you and what are you doing here? Asked the son. Who are you and what are you doing here? Said the wise man. I am a turkey, said the son. I am also a turkey, said the wise man. So they both sat there together for some time until they grew accustomed to each other. The wise man signaled and shirts were given to him. The wise man said, do you think that a turkey cannot wear a shirt? One can wear a shirt and still be a turkey. So they both put on a shirt. After a while, he signaled some pants were given to him. He told the son, do you think that if you wore pants, you would not be a turkey anymore? One could wear pants and still be a turkey. So they both put on the pants and so on. Then he signaled and human food was given to him. And he said to the king's son, do you think that if one eats human food, one cannot remain a turkey? We can eat and still be turkeys. Then he said, one can still be a turkey and eat while sitting at a table. He finally cured the king's son completely. The moral here is self-explanatory. Should one say that one who wants to become close to God cannot do so, for he is like a turkey, in the sense that he is human and materialistic? That is not so. Step by step, one can come closer and closer to serving God until he succeeds.
Okay. Very interesting story. And I want you to focus not on the story, but on the last paragraph here. Because I don't think that the moral is necessarily self-explanatory. All right. If you were a counselor, you might explain the story by saying, well, you want to help somebody, you have to get them to trust you. You need to see the world the way that they see the world. And that's true with the role of the tzaddik. Also, the tzaddik, in order to repair the souls of his followers, he has to go down to their level. Okay? The mystic could explain the story by saying this is descent for the sake of ascent. In other words, like, the Rebbe goes down to the level of his followers in order to help raise them up to a higher level. Right? You go down into material life to raise up the holy sparks that are there. Right? Sin is a very powerful force, and it impedes Devoid. And so the tzaddik has to do something, strong to help the chassid overcome that. So some Hasidic masters saw the gulf between God and human beings as an illusion. And Nachman says, well, it's not an illusion, it's very real, but you have to go down in order to help bring them up. By the way, Nachman didn't believe in any kind of science, did not believe in reason, any of the philosophical tools, even though he personally was very sick and went to doctors. He disparaged the developing field of medicine. And he said, you should rely on faith alone. Well, Nachman also tended to be very focused on the Messiah. So, that kind of affects some of his thinking as well. And here I have to share with you this teaching, text number 15. And this one, just very strange, but I think very important. Someone want to read for us number 15? Go ahead, Roberto.
Okay. Copulation is difficult for the true tzaddik. Not only does he have no desire for it at all, but he experiences real suffering in the act, suffering which is like that which the infant undergoes when he is circumcised. This is very same suffering to an even greater degree is felt by the tzaddik during intercourse. The infant has no awareness, so his suffering is not so great. But the tzaddik, because he is aware of the pain, suffers more greatly than does the infant.
Yeah. So what do you make of this teaching? What do you think this says about Rabbi Nachman?
He was a weirdo.
Yeah. Who, first of all, is the true tzaddik in the text, right? He's talking about himself. Now, some people jump to the conclusion that Nachman is really a homosexual, which, you know, he can't say that to his followers. That would not go over very well. I don't think he's homosexual necessarily. He seems to want to eliminate all sexual desire. And he pays a certain price for, you know, controlling his own desires and impulses. The theme of the dangers of sex and guilt over sex, that's something you see many times in his teaching. Last text here, and with this, we're going to conclude a little early today. This is from back to Dov Ber of Mezerich, right? Where he reinterprets the Lurianic idea of the breaking of the vessels. Someone want to read this for us, please?
King commanded his servants to rise up a very large mountain, removing it from its place, an impossible task. So his servants decided among themselves to dig and break up Shavira, the mountain, into tiny pieces, so that each person would be able to carry a small portion appropriate to his own particular strength. And in this way, they carried out the king's command. Similarly, in this way, God, the King of the universe, commands us to rise up the holy sparks. And it was for this very purpose that the Shavira, breaking of the vessels, came about, so that each person might be able to rise up the fallen sparks, each one according to his own spiritual level.
Mm-hmm. So breaking up the mountain is breaking up the vessels. Now, in Lurianic Kabbalah, the breaking of the vessels was this cosmic catastrophe. In Hasidism, for Dov Ber, it's the means to something better, right? Because of this, everyone will raise up holy sparks and help repair the universe. So, you know, in Lurianic Kabbalah, this was just this huge tikkun. It was an act of repair. In Hasidism, this tends to be chunked down to something more manageable. Right? So this brings us to the end of the first couple of generations of Hasidic teachers. Beginning next week, we'll look at a particularly interesting line of Hasidic rabbis and some of the ways in which their teachings developed, still being faithful to the core teachings of the Baal Shem Tov, but on a slightly different course. So we have to stop a little early today. Thank you all very much, and we will see you next time.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Hope you feel okay.
Yeah, I will be better.